with the building over the last 160 years. Jessie has been in Mount Vernon for about 10 years, and she got her MA from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in history, and has turned that into a study of 18th and 19th century artifacts and families and lives and things like that. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jessie, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's a real privilege to join you, and I was so honored to be invited, and it's lovely to see so many faces and some shirts repping Mount Vernon. I see them back there. So just show of hands, how many of you have been to Mount Vernon?
Come on.
Yeah, that's an incredible thing about working for Mount Vernon, is that almost everyone has been there at some point in their life, often on a school trip or family vacation, but almost everyone has a Mount Vernon experience. And another amazing thing is that Mount Vernon follows me wherever I go, because the architecture of Mount Vernon was so iconic that it inspires buildings across the nation. And I actually added a slide to my presentation this afternoon because I was driving down South Washington Street, Washington, you can't escape, and I came by the Washington Square apartment building, and I almost veered off the road because I said, that looks familiar. That is clearly inspired by the piazza on the Mount Vernon mansion, which is one of its most iconic features. It is what you most often see in buildings that are inspired by Washington's home. So even here in Crawfordsville, hundreds of miles away, Mount Vernon and Washington have made their mark. And that's one thing that I want to talk about today. Mount Vernon has welcomed over 96 million people since we opened our doors as a museum in 1860. We still welcome about 1 million a year. And Washington's home is familiar to almost everyone, but its history as a museum and the story of the remarkable women who saved it is less known. And so today, I'm looking forward to giving you a glimpse into that lesser known story of Mount Vernon as a historic site and the remarkable ways that some of the original Washington objects have come back home to our collection. So first, just a bit of background. A lot of this, I'm sure, will be familiar to you. But Mount Vernon is located on the Potomac River about 15 miles south of Washington, D.C. It was the home of George Washington for 45 years, from 1754 until his death in 1799. Mount Vernon was his favorite place, even as he left to serve as colonel in the French and Indian War, general in the American Revolution, and president of the new United States. He always longed to return to his beloved estate. He wrote in 1790, "I had rather be at Mount Vernon with a friend or two about me than to be attended at the seat of government by the officers of state and representatives of every power in Europe." Over the course of his residence, he expanded the house several times, culminating in the 2.5-story, 11,000 square foot mansion that you see today and that you see in this 1791 painting. He also expanded his property holdings, ultimately operating a plantation of nearly 8,000 acres. Dozens of hired laborers and more than 300 enslaved people staffed Mount Vernon's household, workshops, and fields. So it was a massive operation. In 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a young widow with 2 young children. The couple never had any offspring of their own, but Washington was a devoted stepfather and step-grandfather to Martha's descendants from her first marriage. And here you can see the Washingtons with Martha's 2 youngest grandchildren who lived with the couple for much of their childhoods. George Washington died of a throat infection in December of 1799, and Martha Washington passed away 2.5 years later. After her death, the household's contents were dispersed, and she and her husband bequeathed treasured items to friends and relatives, and other Mount Vernon furnishings were sold at public and private sales after the couple died. So by the time Bushrod Washington, George's nephew, who inherited the estate, moved in, his aunt and uncle's possessions were largely scattered to the winds. In the 19th century, Mount Vernon was owned by a series of collateral Washington descendants who quickly found that the American public saw Mount Vernon as their own. Uninvited tourists showed up on the property to pay respects to Washington's home and tomb, in some cases rather disrespectfully breaking off tree branches and pocketing pebbles as souvenirs. Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington, you can see with her family in this portrait, owned Mount Vernon from 1832 to 1841. Her husband had died shortly after inheriting the property. And she once commented to a friend, "I never would have submitted to the endless intrusions and sacrifices of everything like a private right and domestic privacy to which we are liable here, but that I believe it arises frequently from a sincere, though thoughtless, desire of honoring the memory of General Washington." So the 19th century residents did not enjoy having so many uninvited visitors, but they understood why they came. The costs of maintaining Mount Vernon's 18th century buildings also proved challenging, especially as the plantation's income declined during Virginia's mid-19th century economic depression. In that same letter, Jane Charlotte went on to say, "We have done and shall continue to do all we can to keep the place from entire decay. It is yearly becoming more expensive and difficult to do so. The buildings all ought to be thoroughly repaired, or they must in a few years go down." And thus begins the story of Mount Vernon's preservation. In the fall of 1853, Louisa Bird Cunningham of South Carolina was traveling via steamboat on the Potomac River and described the view in a letter to her daughter. "It was a lovely moonlit night. I went on deck as we passed Mount Vernon. I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind, why was it that the women of this country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it? It does seem such a blot on our country." Her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, who was then 37 years old and unmarried, took up the charge. She sent a letter to a Charleston newspaper under the pseudonym A Southern Matron, calling upon the mothers and daughters of the South to raise general contributions to purchase Mount Vernon, calling it the shrine of true patriotism. Stoking fears of northern industry, she urged them to prevent its threatened desecration by manufacturers and manufactories, noise and smoke, and deafening machinery. In her effort to save Mount Vernon, Cunningham faced enormous challenges. There were virtually no models for private philanthropic organizations devoted to historic preservation at the time, because that was a brand new concept. On top of that, she was a woman in an era when women lacked the right to vote, and prevailing norms dictated that women confine their efforts to the home, and certainly not to public leadership or the management of money and property. Making matters more difficult, Cunningham was an invalid, suffering throughout her life from what she called a nervous disease, which manifested in back and muscle pain, headaches, dizziness, and difficulty walking and breathing. On her first visit to Mount Vernon, the diminutive Cunningham was unable to walk and had to be carried from the wharf up the hill to the mansion. And finally, in the 1850s, there was the small matter that the United States faced a simmering political crisis, with the nation torn apart over slavery and its expansion into Western territories. And yet Cunningham was undeterred, and her instincts were good. Her letter struck a chord, and it was reprinted in outlets across the country. Sensing that her appeal to Southern women was limiting, she quickly rebranded and named her organization the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, which remains the full name of the organization today. In doing so, she extended her efforts nationwide, and she removed her cause from the political sphere and turned her gender from a liability into a strength. Who better to preserve the home of Washington than women, she argued, whose purity and morality made them the most fitting guardians of this national shrine. While Cunningham forged ahead with her fundraising efforts, it took 5 years for her to convince Mount Vernon's last private owner, John Augustine Washington III, to sell his property to a group of women. Washington had initially hoped to dispose of Mount Vernon only to the government of Virginia or the United States. But when neither proved interested, he finally relented. In February of 1858, Cunningham and Washington signed an agreement in which the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would pay $200,000, which is about $7 million in today's currency, in installments over 5 years. With this agreement in place, Cunningham doubled down on her fundraising efforts and formalized the structure of her organization. Styling herself as the regent, she appointed a series of vice regents, each representing their state, who coordinated fundraising efforts within their region. These vice regents then appointed lady managers who solicited donations on a local level. So here I want to go on a brief digression to tell you a bit more about the connections between the MVLA and the state of Indiana. The original vice regent for Indiana was Harriet Satterley Fitch, who was the wife of Graham Newell Fitch, who at the time was the U.S. Senator for Indiana. And this was quite common. Many of the early vice regents were the wives or daughters of politicians or prominent businessmen, and Cunningham hoped that those political and social connections could prove useful to the organization. To raise money, with the vice regents, like Mrs. Fitch, sold lithographs of Gilbert Stuart's famous portrait of Washington, which somebody very conveniently has brought. I illustrated it in my lecture, but I can show you right here an example, which I hope you all will come look at afterwards. But it says beneath the portrait, tribute to the Mount Vernon Fund. So these were sold for $1 a piece. The MVLA also published a monthly newsletter called the Mount Vernon Record. Subscriptions were $1 per issue. And it also it printed fundraising appeals, historical articles, and the names of donors to the Mount Vernon Fund. Now, the Mount Vernon Record also listed the names of the local lady managers, and we can see that their efforts extended even here to Crawfordsville. In the July 7th, 1859 issue of the Crawfordsville Weekly Journal, there was actually an appeal to local citizens to donate money to the Mount Vernon Fund. And likewise, in the Mount Vernon Record of that same month, the lady managers for Indiana were listed. And these included Mrs. I.C. Elston, who was none other than the mother of Susan Wallace. So, as I'm sure you all know, Maria Elston, the mother of Susan Wallace, the mother-in-law of Lou Wallace, was, of course, a prominent resident of the town, and it was women like her who around the country were raising awareness and raising money for the cause of Mount Vernon. So the Wallaces undoubtedly would have been well aware of the effort to purchase Mount Vernon, as were people across the nation who were hearing it at the local level from people like this. And there was the potential for even greater connection between the Elston-Wallace family and Mount Vernon, which I discovered when I was looking at some old Mount Vernon archives. So the original vice regent for Indiana, Mrs. Fitch, died in 1880, and that led to a search for her replacement. And at the council meeting of 1891, the regent nominated Mrs. Lou Wallace to be the vice regent for Indiana. Alas, the annual report of that year reported that she declined the position. So unfortunately, one wonders what might have been. But that was a very fun little discovery that I made as I was preparing for my remarks today. So instead of Mrs. Wallace, in 1901, the ladies appointed Martha Fitch Denby, who was actually the daughter of Harriet Fitch. This was also very common. There were a lot of daughters and nieces and daughters-in-law who succeeded their older relatives in serving the Mount Vernon ladies. And Mrs. Denby was the wife of Charles Harvey Denby, who was the U.S. minister to China from 1885 to 1898, and they actually lived in China with their family. They have a fascinating story. She only served the organization for 5 years. She died in 1906. She was succeeded by Mary Newcomer Walcott of Muncie. Mrs. Walcott was the wife of Benjamin Doolittle Walcott, who was the president of the Indianapolis Terracotta Company, which manufactured architectural cladding, decorative details for buildings that was less expensive than stone. And there are actually a lot of surviving buildings that retain those decorations. And that's just one example in Indianapolis. But one of the duties of the vice regents was to raise public awareness of the effort to preserve Mount Vernon. And Mrs. Walcott's reports to the board were full of details about talks that she gave to local chapters of the DAR and the Colonial Danes, to church groups and school children. And it also noted that she employed the latest technology, giving presentations using a radiopticon, which was a new device in the early 20th century, which was essentially a projector that allowed her to enlarge postcards of Mount Vernon on a wall or a screen so that people could actually see what Mount Vernon looked like. In 1914, Mrs. Walcott also received a donation of an antique chest of drawers made of cherry wood from the Dorothy Q chapter of the DAR from Crawfordsville. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down where this item was used or if it's still in our collection. The records from those early years are spotty, but that's an avenue for further research, and so I will look into it and see if I can find anything more. The vice regent for the bulk of the 20th century was Elizabeth Holliday Hitz, who was a 1916 Bryn Mawr graduate who was known as Hitzy, which I love. She served devotedly for 42 years, which was a tenure that was common, very common at the time. It's less common now. There's now a mandatory retirement age of 75 for vice regents, but there were many who had decades-long tenures of service. Mrs. Hitz was followed by Georgianne Davis Neal, who attended Radcliffe and was a staff writer for the Harvard Crimson. Mrs. Neal began her career as a news reporter, and her husband, James T. Neal, was the third generation of his family to own, edit, and publish the Noblesville Daily Ledger newspaper. Mrs. Neal was also president of the Indiana Public Broadcasting Society and the Indianapolis Junior League, and her daughter is actually currently the vice regent for Wisconsin. And finally, oops, she's also in there. The most recent vice regent for Indiana was Alfred Coles Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn is an interior and fashion designer, and after her husband's death in 2000, she also took over his firm, Blackburn Architects, which, among many other projects, designed the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. And Mrs. Blackburn was the first African-American vice regent, and she was instrumental in championing efforts to tell the story of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. She served on over 60 boards, commissions, and committees, including chairing the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, and in 2022, she was named an Indiana Living Legend. So while the state of Indiana is not currently represented on the board, these women have left a formidable legacy, and undoubtedly that legacy will be continued in the future. So now, I want to jump back in time. The year is 1860, and thanks to a wildly successful fundraising effort, the association has paid off the cost of Mount Vernon, all $200,000, in 2 years instead of 5. And they are now faced with the formidable task of restoring the house and opening it to the public as a museum. This was a new endeavor, as I mentioned. In the mid-19th century, there was no model for a historic house museum. While others suggested to Anne Pamela Cunningham that she might turn Mount Vernon into a memorial sculpture park, or replace the aging house with a replica, or tear down all the accessory buildings except for Washington's house and tomb, Cunningham was clear in her vision of restoring Mount Vernon as Washington knew it. The mansion and the grounds around it should be religiously guarded from change, should be kept as Washington left them, she urged fellow ladies in her 1875 farewell address. Those who go to the home in which he lived and died wish to see in what he lived and died. The association's first priority then was to begin much needed repairs to the buildings, and as you can imagine from seeing this 1862 photograph where the south chimney is propped up to prevent its collapse, these were extensive and costly. But almost immediately, too, they also began to bring original Washington objects home. The association's very first acquisition occurred even before they had taken over the property. In February of 1859, the ladies heard word that the daughter-in-law of Nellie Custis, Martha Washington's youngest granddaughter, who was the child seen in that portrait we looked at earlier, wished to donate Nellie's harpsichord, which had been a gift from George Washington in 1793 when Nellie was a teenager and a very talented musician. The ladies accepted this donation, and John Augustine Washington, who was still living in the house at the time, accommodated it and allowed the harpsichord to be dropped off at Mount Vernon even before the ladies officially took over. When the Washington family vacated the house in 1860, they left behind an eclectic assortment of original Washington items that formed the basis of the MVLA's collection. These included the Bastille key, which was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington just after the storming of the French prison. That has been displayed in a case on the wall of the central passage of the mansion since the 18th century. A series of leather fire buckets, which were part of the rather rudimentary fire prevention system of the 18th century. A piece of coral that Washington had acquired during his only trip outside of the country to Barbados when he was a teenager. The bust of George Washington by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon, which was said to be the best likeness of Washington by those who knew him. Washington's globe, which he acquired during his presidency from the globe maker to King George III, and which he took back to Mount Vernon and used in his study. And a leather canteen, which was part of Washington's military equipment during the Revolutionary War. So the ladies had a small assortment of objects, but the rooms of the house remained largely empty, as you can see from this engraving showing visitors to the Washington's bedchamber in the late 1850s. As a solution, Nancy Halsted, who was the vice regent from New Jersey, proposed that each room of the house be adopted by a particular state, and with that state's vice regent soliciting donations of furniture and relics to outfit the space. In an 1869 appeal to New Jersey residents, Mrs. Halsted declared, "Any article of antiquity in good order, in furniture or for ornament, will be gratefully received at Mount Vernon." In 1870, the council minutes noted that the state of New Jersey, stimulated by the energy and enthusiasm of its vice regent, had sent furniture, carpets, and antiquities to the value of nearly $2,000. These items were not purported to be owned by Washington, and in general, they were just what was considered old at the time, which was generally kind of what my grandmother had in her house. But they provided the house with a much-needed home-like appearance. While some rooms aimed to recreate kind of the domestic world, others served more as galleries and repositories of relics. And as you can see in the New York room, which today is called the New Room, Rembrandt Peale's monumental painting, Washington Before Yorktown, which was painted in 1824 and thus never seen by George Washington, dominated the west wall. The canvas was in fact so large that it had to be removed from its stretchers and rolled up in order to fit into the room. Other rooms held relic cases that were filled with an assortment of curiosities, some with only tenuous connections to George Washington. There were the ever-popular locks of Washington's hair, a fragment of his coffin, articles of clothing, a piece of wood from the Old North Bridge of Revolutionary War fame in Concord, Massachusetts, and a taxidermied woodpecker shot on Mount Vernon grounds. In the late 19th century, however, the ladies began to coalesce around a strategy for furnishing the mansion based on the inventory that was taken at George Washington's death, which listed the items that were in each room of the house. And that is actually the strategy that still guides our furnishing efforts today. And likewise, they focused their energy on not simply filling the rooms, but actually acquiring original George Washington material. And around this time, more original Washington objects started to emerge. From a combination of declining emotional connections to the objects and financial resources diminished by the Civil War, some members of the Washington and Custis families realized that they were willing to part with family treasures, especially if it brought in much needed cash. In 1890 and 91, there were two major auctions of items that descended through George Washington's nephews. And while the ladies lacked the funds for major acquisitions due to the ongoing expense of repairs to the house, Many of the vice regents purchased objects on behalf of their states and donated them to Mount Vernon, and this was typically how acquisitions worked in those early years. So some of the items that came through this auction remain in our collection today, such as a punch bowl, mantel clock, card table, and numerous books from George Washington's library. And while many acquisitions of this era came from prominent descendants of the Washington and Custis families, others came through more unexpected connections. In 1891, the MVLA was contacted by the minister of a Washington, D.C. church, whose parishioner, an 86-year-old black woman named Lucy Harrison, was in possession of a chair said to be at the bedside of George Washington when he died. Harrison had, her minister explained, contended with several strokes of paralysis and looked to the money from the sale of the chair for comfort when her strength fails. Phoebe Everson Hearst, the wife of businessman and U.S. Senator George Hearst and the mother of publishing mogul William Randolph Hearst, was then serving as vice regent for California, and she agreed to buy the chair for $100 and donate it to Mount Vernon. But researching recent records has revealed even more details about who Lucy Harrison was and why she might have had this original Washington chair. Harrison's mother was Caroline Graham, who was an enslaved housemaid at Mount Vernon, who lit the fire in the bedchamber of the Washington's room every morning and was present in the room when George Washington died, according to the account of Washington's secretary. Lucy Harrison was born around 1806 at Arlington House, the home of Martha's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. And 19th century sources and family oral history suggest that Custis was likely Lucy's father. Harrison received her freedom in 1846, and in 1870, according to the census, which you can see an excerpt from there, she was living in Washington, D.C. with her daughter, Caroline, and working as a laundress. Through it all, she kept this chair, a daily reminder of her own complex ties to the Washington and Custis families, and today, a reminder to us of the complicated world through which these objects descended. On the other end of the spectrum, some objects took winding paths back to Mount Vernon through the most powerful men in America. George Washington purchased this leather upholstered armchair in 1790, and he used it throughout his presidency. The chair seat contains a swivel mechanism, much like a modern office chair, and Washington, who delighted in technology, called it his uncommon chair. When he retired, he brought it back to Mount Vernon, and it stood in his study. Washington left his uncommon chair to Dr. James Craik, who was his personal physician, and sometime in the 1820s, Craik's descendants gave the chair to Andrew Jackson, who was, of course, the 7th president of the United States. And this sounds strange. It makes sense in some ways. In the 1820s, many Washington admirers became devotees of Jackson, who shared Washington's legacy as a military hero turned president, although with very different politics. The Jackson family members kept the chair at their Nashville plantation, the Hermitage, and you can actually see it in that photograph on the right, along with Andrew Jackson's sword. And in 1905, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, having become aware of its existence, purchased the chair from Jackson's descendants for $500, with $25 donated by Tennessee school children. The uncommon chair was not the only object to come to Mount Vernon via a U.S. president. This military sash is known as the Braddock sash because it belonged to Washington's commander during the French and Indian War, General Edward Braddock. Braddock purportedly gave Washington this sash after he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. And the red silk sash, as you can see in this portrait of Washington, was generally worn across the chest as a symbol of rank. Officers would wear it, but it also had a practical use. It doubled as a stretcher to carry injured officers off of the battlefield. It's actually made of a technique called sprang weaving, which allows it to stretch horizontally very, very far, and silk is incredibly strong. It actually has a tensile strength of steel. So it is actually extremely effective for that purpose. And we don't know whether Braddock was literally carried off the battlefield in this sash, but it does have some stains that look suspiciously like blood So, you know, one can imagine. After George Washington's death, this sash was inherited by Martha's granddaughter, Nellie Parke Custis Lewis, whose daughter and son-in-law presented it in 1846 to Zachary Taylor, who then was a hero of the Mexican-American War, and of course would become U.S. president in 1849. After his death the following year, the sash passed to his daughter. Fast forward to 1918, and Prince Yoshihisa Tokugawa, who is the son of the last shogun of Japan, you can see in this image, visited Mount Vernon. And according to MBLA records, he was so impressed with sentiments of admiration and with reverence for the memory of General Washington that he made a personal gift of $1,000 to be used for the purpose of purchasing some relic which it would be appropriate to place in General Washington's home. So with that money, the ladies purchased this sash from President Taylor's descendants. While the aforementioned items had a very public afterlife, other Washington objects disappeared from public view for more than a century. In 1948, the MBLA was contacted by descendants of Eliza Parke Custis Law, who is Martha Washington's eldest granddaughter. These descendants had a military trunk of George Washington's that was filled to the brim with family treasures. The trunk contained a blue cloth coat, linen waistcoat and trousers, knit garters worn by General Washington. They had Washington's false teeth. They had a brown satin gown, white satin slippers, a sunbonnet and other clothing worn by Mrs. Washington, and a patchwork quilt cover made by Martha herself, among many, many other items. And most of these were actually accompanied by notes from Eliza herself, detailing the object's histories, which is, you know, as a curator and historian, that's all you can ask for. Regarding the blue coat, she remarked, "This coat was made of the first American cloth sent to General Washington and much worn by him. My grandmother gave it to me as a relic. The buttons were begged from me by many who prized them as relics of the father of our country." So the grandchildren were very good stewards of many objects, but they did not flinch at removing pieces of them to distribute to others as tokens. And so, as Eliza suggests, this coat has no buttons because she distributed them. And similarly, on a dress bodice of Martha Washington, she noted, "This is the body of a favorite gown of my dear grandmother's. I used the other part in a dress for myself, as long as it lasted, then made it into small bags to give the fare of the Sisters of Charity. Thus it is preserved for many more eager to possess a relic of Mrs. Washington." In fact, through separate channels, Mount Vernon has actually acquired several of these bags that Eliza made from the skirt of the dress. So they have been reunited, and it is a wonderful story of how these things had very interesting afterlives as relics in different ways. So these were not the only descendants to come calling with a mysterious trunk of Washington objects. In 2007, Mary Lee Bowman and her brother Robert E. Lee IV decided to open 2 trunks that had long been stored in the corner of Mrs. Bowman's basement. Inside, they discovered a trove of Washington silver. We should all be so lucky, right? Including this 4-bottle wine cooler and silver bottle roller. So George Washington had acquired these tablewares from London during his presidency. The 4-bottle wine cooler could be filled with ice and placed on the table to keep glass decanters of wine cool. Washington quickly realized, however, that when full, these coolers could weigh as much as 8 pounds, and the weight would, he feared, make them too unwieldy to pass, especially by ladies. So as a solution, he commissioned a custom bottle roller, which is the item you see on the right, which similarly had space for 4 glass decanters, but it had the benefit of casters on the bottom, little wheels, so it could be rolled across the table instead of passed. So again, Washington's interest in technology and ingenuity on display. After Martha Washington's death, the family silver, including these objects, was passed to her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who saved it along with numerous other relics at his Arlington House home, which he turned into a museum, essentially, to Washington's memory. The author Benson Lossing actually visited Custis and sketched these items for his 1859 book on Mount Vernon and George Washington. After Custis died, the silver descended to his daughter, Mary Custis Lee, who had married General Robert E. Lee. When the Civil War began, General Lee knew that Arlington House could become a target, and he urged his wife and children to evacuate, and indeed the Union Army did occupy Arlington House for most of the war. The Lees packed up the Washington silver into trunks and sent them to safekeeping to Virginia Military Institute, which was 180 miles away in Lexington, Virginia. But in 1864, Union General David Hunter raided that region, and the silver was only saved thanks to the quick thinking of the VMI superintendent, who buried the two trunks underground. So when General Hunter set fire to all the public buildings on the VMI campus, the trunks to the family heirlooms were safe beneath the Earth's surface. So thanks to these actions, the Lee descendants, many generations later, were able to rediscover this silver in their basement and then donate it to Mount Vernon, which they did very generously. In recent years, the pace of Mount Vernon's acquisition of original Washington objects has slowed simply because most things have surfaced and we have been able to acquire a number of important objects. But every once in a while, items become available that we can't pass up. In 2012, Christie's auctioned off George Washington's personal copy of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which are known as the Acts of Congress. Washington rarely wrote in his books, but this volume actually contains marginal notes where he's flagging his duties as president. You know, he was the first one. He was figuring out exactly what he needed to do and what the new nation allowed for in this newly created role. As you can imagine, Mount Vernon had stiff competition in this auction, and ultimately the volume sold for nearly $10 million. Unlike the early days of the association, when acquisitions were largely funded through the generosity of individual vice regents, thankfully today we do have an acquisitions endowment, and we have many donors who are willing to help us with these once-in-a-lifetime purchase opportunities. The last acquisition I'll highlight is one of the most recent, a series of objects that descended in the family of another of Martha Washington's grandchildren, Martha Parke Custis Peter. The Peter family collection consists of nearly 100 objects from Mount Vernon, ranging from Martha Washington's diamond-studded watch to a silver baby rattle to an 18th century coffee grinder. Many of these objects had actually been on loan at Mount Vernon for decades, but we were fortunate to have the opportunity to add them to our collection through purchase in 2020. And it was thanks to years of staff cultivating relationships with the owners that allowed us to finally bring them home to Mount Vernon. And you know, that's not the most dramatic, but it is often how these things happen, where we're able to provide a home and store things temporarily, and then those become permanent. Today, Mount Vernon's curatorial and library staff receive hundreds of inquiries every year concerning possible Washington and Mount Vernon objects. With a collection of roughly 20,000 objects and limited storage facilities, we're guided in whether we acquire objects by our collecting priorities. And I know these may be too small to read, but I can read them for you. So our very first priority are objects original to Mount Vernon or owned by George and Martha Washington. This is the kind of thing that we will drop everything to get for our collection. The second priority are period objects that represent things that the Washingtons had that we don't necessarily have anymore that aren't available. So these are things that we use to fill out the furnishings of the mansion, much like the ladies did in those early days, although our understanding of what is period appropriate is a bit more advanced than it was in the early days. And then finally, our third priority are memorabilia and commemorative items that relate to George Washington's legacy or to the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So these aren't things that will be going in the house necessarily, but they're things we can display in our museum as part of the larger story of George Washington's life. And then there is a fourth category, which I don't know that you would call it acquisitions necessarily, but it's something that's shaped both by what we have and by what we know we don't have. And that is reproductions of original objects. So when we can't find Washington's original, or if it's not safe to continue displaying it, we commission reproductions of those objects. And those do become part of our collection. They're cataloged in a slightly different way, but we consider them collection objects. So for example, currently in the mansion we have a fully playable replica of Nellie Custis's harpsichord, which is an incredible object because we can actually hear the sounds of the 18th century. The original long ago stopped being playable, and so this was an incredibly exciting project. And having that replica allows us to display the original in our museum environment, which is much more stable environmentally than the 18th century house, which, while it is conditioned, is very leaky. So we have trouble maintaining a stable environment there. Another example of a situation where we've taken advantage of reproductions is in the front parlor, where we have evidence that George Washington purchased a suite of upholstered furniture and window curtains in a vivid shade of Saxon blue, which you can see here. But the original pieces are not known to survive, and period examples are very, very hard to come by. So to ensure the accuracy of the space, we commissioned a suite of furniture in the style and color that we knew Washington had. So in this situation, ironically, reproductions actually make the space more authentic than if we were to use period objects that were not quite right. So today, the public sees Mount Vernon's rich collection primarily in two spaces. In the mansion, the rooms are furnished, as I mentioned earlier, according to George Washington's inventory. We redo the rooms on a rotating basis, so every decade or two, we use the new research and objects that we've acquired to refurnish the room according to the latest scholarship. And the rooms feature a mix of original Washington objects, appropriate 18th century pieces, and reproductions that combine to provide visitors with what Anne Pamela Cunningham envisioned, which is an accurate view of in what George Washington lived and died. We also have a new museum installation, which just opened in April. It is entitled Mount Vernon, the Story of an American Icon. And it showcases objects that are either too fragile to display in the house, like the harpsichord, or things that are best displayed in a gallery environment. So in this exhibit, we have the original Lodon bust of George Washington. We have the original uncommon chair and harpsichord. We have family portraits, porcelain and silver, and a rotating display of clothing and original documents. So in this setting, visitors can really take their time and convene and commune with the collection and see how these objects really help us better understand George Washington and Mount Vernon. So, visionary though she was, it's unlikely Anne Pamela Cunningham could have imagined what Mount Vernon would look like today. Thanks to the tireless work of generations of ladies, the generous donations of descendants and supporters, and the unflagging interest of visitors to the estate, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has, on behalf of the nation, safeguarded this place and its objects for generations to come. Thank you. And I'd love to
Were those bright colors really the ones that were there?
Yeah, so we often get asked if the bright
I
colors
always
are
thought it
original.
more muted, you know.
Yeah, so it's
Or
interesting.
wallpaper.
Yeah, so it's a common misconception that people in the 18th century liked kind of plain, muted colors, and a lot of that is from the colonial revival in the late 19th century. When those styles came back, that's kind of how they were imagined, and that still influences our thinking today. But we've actually done scientific paint analysis that allows us to see what colors the walls were at different periods of time, and they were bright. They liked their colors in the 18th century, and they liked their vivid patterns of wallpaper and textiles too. So it is very busy and lively. Yes.
When that green from the main dining room showed up, it created a stir really across the country. People, if you see it, it is a shocking color.
Yeah, very striking. Yes.
I had heard that he had a brother, and his brother's farm and estate was nearby Mount Vernon, across the road or something, and a few miles away. Is that right?
So Washington actually inherited Mount Vernon itself from his elder brother. His elder half-brother Lawrence was actually the one who named it Mount Vernon. Lawrence had fought in the War of Jenkins' Ear, which was between England and Spain, under Admiral Edward Vernon, who was a very celebrated English war hero at the time. And so he named Mount Vernon after him. So ironically, Mount Vernon is named for an English war hero. So Washington inherited the estate from his older brother, and so that may be what you're thinking of. And then, as I mentioned, after his death, it was owned by a series of descendants, and the land was kind of divided up over time as they sold off parcels. So hopefully that answers your question.
I'm tickled to find the Wallace connections to Mount Vernon. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was very excited when I found that. Yes.
How many acres do you have there, or in the restoration area, that you have the whole village used?
So today we have about 450 acres of that original 8,000. As I mentioned, descendants sold off parcels of land, and actually the ladies, when they initially acquired Mount Vernon, they got about 200 acres. So we've actually expanded it since that initial purchase, but it's still nowhere near the original bounds of the estate. And unfortunately, much of that land is now housing developments and commercial areas. So we're not going to reassemble the entire Mount Vernon, but we do have a significant property.
And one of the things they've taken on too is looking at some of Washington's varied interests, because the barn has been recreated. He was a very, and I think he made brandy or
Whiskey. Yeah. So we have a site kind of away, maybe a quarter-mile away from the house, where we show farming and have demonstration of the type of agriculture that Washington pursued at Mount Vernon. And then we also own the site of his gristmill and distillery. He operated a mill for many, many years, both for himself and as a commercial venture. And then in 1797, upon the advice of his Scottish farm manager, he opened a distillery, a whiskey distillery, which was extremely profitable. But unfortunately, Washington died just 2 years later, so it did not have a very long life. But we have reconstructed both of those buildings, and they are operational. So we grind wheat and corn in the grist mill, and we make whiskey, as well as peach and apple brandy and some other spirits. So,
which we would never do. Susan Wallace was a teetotaler.
and you can purchase it, and it's available for sale. Yes.
His grave's still there?
Yes. Yeah. His tomb is there. Yeah, it's about. It's also about a quarter mile away from the mansion. He was actually reinterred, interestingly, in the 1830s, when he was buried in the old family tomb at the time of his death. In his will, he actually directed that a new tomb be built because the old one was crumbling and in very poor condition. So it took a little while, but the later Washingtons constructed a new tomb in the 1830s, and his and Martha, their coffins and other family members were removed to that new tomb. So now it's a very grand structure, and you can see it today, and they have twice daily wreath-laying ceremonies, so it's very much a part of the experience of visiting Mount Vernon. Yeah.
Go.
How many visitors are there now, and how much does it cost?
So our numbers were affected by COVID somewhat, but we're trending back towards 1.1 million visitors a year, which was what we were at consistently pre-COVID. The cost, gosh, I don't know the exact number. It's in the mid-20s, I think, about $25. But it is really a whole day experience, so hopefully people feel they get their money's worth. And there are ways, if you buy your ticket online early, you can get a slight discount, that sort of thing. But we do get a lot of our money from ticket sales. That is our, not all museums operate that way, but we do. So in that sense, COVID was challenging for us. We're working on expanding our endowment so that we aren't so reliant on ticket sales, so that things like COVID don't affect us quite so much. But visitors have been the lifeblood of Mount Vernon since we opened to the public, and we do rely on visitors representation to help us, sustain the projects that we do. Yes.
How big is the staff? I mean, that's a lot of building, a lot of ground.
Yeah, we have about 400 staff members.
Full time?
Not all full-time, some are part-time. But yeah, so that's everything from, people like me who do historical research and work with collection, to tour guides, groundskeepers, wait staff in the restaurant, cleaning crews, people who do the demonstrations with the animals on the farm, our development department who are out raising money, our education department who are, doing teacher institutes. We have a large staff who are, focused on many different parts of our operation.
Along with that, do you have internships available?
We do, yeah. There are internships in lots of different departments. We always post things on our website, so if anyone knows people who are interested in museums, that's the place to look. But yes, there are opportunities like that. Yes.
I have a friend here whose mother-in-law was a manager forever in Kansas. And she told this wonderful story that maybe you can confirm, Jessie, that all the managers across the country, when they would get together, they didn't call themselves by their first names. They called themselves Kansas or Indiana, that because that was their way of divorcing themselves from the status as their husband's wives or daughters.
If you look at the old minutes, and it will say it's always the vice regent from Kansas or from Maryland. It's rarely their actual name, which makes it very difficult if you're looking for a specific person to find them. But yeah, and actually even today I've gotten an email that was signed Arkansas. So they still follow that sometimes. Yeah.
In the last Wallace connection, you mentioned Benson Losing. That was one of Wallace's very best friends.
Oh.
And Mrs. Wallace and Mrs. Losing were classmates together in school when they went to high school. New York.
Oh,
So they
okay.
maintained a family relationship, friendly relationship for the rest of their lives.
Oh wow. Well, there you go.
Lots of times.
Yeah.
I'm sure Jessie would stay around for a few minutes if anybody has any personal questions. Again, I do let you know that our next talk is in a couple of weeks. It'll still be here. And we thank you for coming, and we hope that you'll come again. So thank you very much, Jessie.